Our next speaker is Chris Cronin. He's with HALOCK Security Labs, and he's going to be joining us in just a moment. And again, if you'd like to follow up with any questions, or if you'd like to find out more about any of HALOCK's products or services, be sure to visit them in the virtual exhibition hall right after Chris's presentation. Chris, take it away.
Security Labs. Today I'll be talking to you about duty of care risk analysis and how you can use it to help you achieve CMMC, CCPA, and other privacy and security requirements that you might find challenging. During our talk today, we're going to look at these four elements. The first is looking at CMMC requirements, then CCPA requirements. Then I'm going to take some time to sympathize with you, and then I'm going to blow your mind. But let's start with CMMC. This is a new set of requirements that comes from the Department of Defense. They're trying to secure the supply chain. 350,000 plus vendors and downstream vendors must certify to this new security standard. The certification methods and processes are being managed by the CMMC Accreditation Board. They're independent of the Department of Defense, and they're operating sort of like the PCI Security Council does, but it's their job to be sure that the assessors and organizations are appropriately certified to make sure that the CMMC is appropriately enforced. So what does CMMC entail? Well, it protects controlled, unclassified information. If you're already a DoD supplier or vendor, you'll know what that classification means. It looks similar to NIST 800-171 and the cybersecurity framework. It crosswalks to standards that you're already familiar with, and it's a risk-based categorization process where the more risk you pose to the DoD supply chain, the higher level of maturity that you're going to have to demonstrate in the security controls. The timeline for CMMC is that there's a beta process now with assessors and organizations each trying out this the certification process to see if it works before it rolls out completely in the spring of 2021. The Department of Defense and CMMC Accreditation Board expect by that time in spring that it'll be fully rolled out and greenlit. So if you want to maintain those contracts with DoD, you're going to need to be getting certified to CMMC soon. When we work with our clients for CMMC, we're helping them implement the controls that are already in the standard that's been released. They won't surprise you. What these controls are: access control, asset management, accountability and audit, maintenance, security assessments. These are all things that organizations are already doing if you're applying some kind of control standard. Now, remember earlier I said I'm going to blow your mind. Well, there's a hint here about what that's about: risk management. We're going to see how that applies as well to CCPA. So CCPA is a little different. This is a privacy requirement. It comes to us from the state of California. It gets deep into organizations. The more they use personal information in their organization, the deeper CCPA gets. Well, who must comply with CCPA? Any organization that has a gross annual revenue over 25 million, or handles information to 50,000 or more California residents, or derives more than half of their annual revenue from selling personal information. Well, what does CCPA entail? Well, it controls and protects the personal information about California consumers, consumer households, and the devices that they use. Here's how to think of it, because CCPA is a new type of privacy control for privacy requirement in the US. Think about personal information as a commodity that consumers own. They may choose to share it, but if they share it with an organization, that organization must use it according to the consumer's consent, and they must be accountable to that. What's the timeline for CCPA? Well, by now, it's in full effect. The Attorney General started to pursue this as a fully written regulation on July 1st of 2020. Class action suits are also now in flight. And there's an update that appears to be on its way. CPRA, set for legislation in November 2020, actually increases private rights of action. So it makes it makes it easier for people to sue as a class against organizations who violate CCPA. So what are the control requirements for a CCPA? Well, these are different from just standard security controls. They address privacy issues and accountability. Organizations provide notice to individuals about how they're using that information. Consumers have a right to be forgotten. They can say, hey, take my data out of the system as if I never existed, within reason. Consumers have choices once they're given notice about what they're allowed to have done and not allowed to have done with their information. And there's this requirement for reasonable security. Another hint, this is part of how we're going to blow your mind a little later. So when you think about security, think about preventing other people from doing bad things with the information and systems that are in your care. When you think of privacy, well, that's more like you being a steward. You're preventing yourself from doing bad things with personal information. Now, this is happening all over the world. Privacy requirements to think about personal information as a commodity are increasing globally. We've heard of GDPR, but countries outside of the EU are adopting these requirements as well. In the United States, there are 3 states that have this kind of new personal privacy requirement, but we've got a number of other states who are starting their own legislation for privacy rules. The one that's happening in Illinois is very interesting. If you are interested in knowing what this even next more interesting step is for privacy regulations, contact me and we'll have a conversation about it. Something very interesting is happening there. Now, these new privacy requirements are all going to be different, and they're stacked on top of the regulations and security standards that you're already obligated to follow. This gets really frustrating. You have a lot of controls. Sometimes they contradict each other. It's what Tony Sager from Center for Internet Security calls the fog of more. The idea that there is more to take care of. There are more requirements that you've got to do. They contradict each other. It's hard to prioritize. You're told to have more tools. Well, what are those tools doing? The fog of more makes it difficult for us to have clarity and to see what it is that we should be prioritizing. And this is where I sympathize with you. Because nobody understands the challenges that you're going through. It's all very confusing, and they put it on your shoulders. How are you going to figure out all these things that sometimes contradict, sometimes have too many items to even list? Nobody understands you. It looks overwhelming, as if you'll never get through it. Well, let's start bringing you up and lifting you, thinking about happier things, thinking about lunch, because, ladies and gentlemen, this is where I blow your mind. You see, all these standards bodies and regulators, they all know you can't get to 100% compliance. In fact, you're not even supposed to. They're okay with that. That should blow your mind. So why is this true? What do I mean by this? Well, when you look at those standards and regulations, you keep seeing these terms, reasonable and risk-based. This means they're not expecting you to get to 100% compliance. You just have to do a really good job of showing why you believe something to be reasonable and risk-based. And this is where duty of care risk analysis comes in. Let's put yourself in the mind of a regulator or a litigator or a judge after a breach. They're going to ask you some questions. Just because you've had a breach doesn't mean that you did something wrong, but they want to figure out whether you were doing as well as you should have been doing. They're going to ask, did you think through the likelihood of potential incidents and the magnitude of harm that could have occurred to others? Not just to you, but to others. Are you thinking about others in your risk analysis? Did you consider the value of engaging in the risk that you were doing to begin with? What safeguards did you consider to address some of the risks that looked to be too high? Would those safeguards have been more costly than the risk? And would those safeguards have created other risks? What are these regulators and litigators actually asking you with these questions? They're asking, did you think about the risk to others, the potential impact and likelihood that could occur to others, and balance them against the impact to you? What they're saying is, if you've got a control that you've got to implement, do that, but don't make it greater than the risk that you're protecting others from. But you have to be explicit in how you showed you thought that through. Here's a recent decision from the state of Pennsylvania. Orbitz had a breach under Expedia, who had just acquired them. And what Pennsylvania did was they said, look, you've got to get this environment secure. We're going to tell you you have to demonstrate reasonable safeguards. And what we mean by that is a control has to be appropriate to protect consumers while not being more burdensome to Orbitz than the risk they address. And then they show the rules by which Orbitz Expedia is to demonstrate reasonableness. They're going to look at obligations owed to consumers, the social utility or the mission of the risky behavior to begin with. Is it worth it? The foreseeability and magnitude of harm, the burden of controls against Orbitz's utility and the objectives posed by the safeguards. What are they really trying to say here? They're saying you're going to do a risk assessment and you're going to think about the kinds of harm that could come to you and to others, and you're going to make sure they're in balance. So let's look at what we mean by risk analysis. If I look at ISO 27005, factor analysis for information risk, that's the process that is most associated with Jack Jones. CIS-RAM, that's the process that I wrote with Center for Internet Security. Applied Information Economics, that's what's associated with Doug Hubbard. Or NIST 800-30, they're all saying that risk is made of two components, impacts and likelihoods. Let's get into a little bit more detail there. If I have an impact score and a likelihood score, I should figure out what my risk score is, right? Now, this is a demonstration of what that looks like when you have a range of, say, 1 through 5 for your impacts and likelihood scores. You'll have a risk of 12 if you multiply 4 times 3. You can do this quantitatively as well. If you're the kind of organization that operates to percentages of dollars, you can use this math as well. Some organizations are more or less comfortable with these different methods. I'm going to illustrate most of this using the ordinals that you find with qualitative analysis. But what do these 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 things mean? You're going to want a plain language way to describe what they mean, because you're going to want consistency in how you estimate. Well, let's say you have an impact of 3 because you believe something is going to be an unacceptable impact. Negligible is 1, 2 is acceptable, 3 is unacceptable, 4 is high, and 5 is catastrophic. You could do something similar with likelihood in terms of the possibility, plausibility, or frequency of something. And you can come up with a fairly good risk score that way and some kinds of consistency. If you're doing quantitative analysis, you would do this by associating certain curves of acceptability, recoverable, you hit to a recoverable line or you hit to a catastrophic line, your red risk in there might be somewhere between negligible and catastrophic. So there are ways to do this, but what we're saying is figure out what you believe to be acceptable, recoverable, or catastrophic so that when you do risk analysis, say, I know whether I'm okay with this or not. I know whether I would invest in it or not. Let's get a little more specific here. If we're doing risk analysis and we're using plain language, we want these estimates to be meaningful. So let's say we're looking at the impact to profitability. We're going to want boundaries for what we believe to be impacts of profitability that we would take action on. How about our negligible score of 1, meaning our profitability is on plan? Negligible impact for profitability, of course we're on plan. How about acceptable? How would we talk about an acceptable impact against profitability? Well, we would say it's within our planned variance, right? If it's out of variance, now all of a sudden it's not acceptable. We would invest against being out of variance for a profitability plan. What if we lose profitability, but we can recover it in 3 years, but if we go over 3 years, that's catastrophic. We go out of business. Now we have a way to draw a line between what's high and what's catastrophic. And we do something similar with likelihood, using plain language things that people can use in a fairly consistent way. Now, if I've organized my thinking this way, where I've got a clear delineation between those things I would invest in and not, I also have the basis to make a decision about when risks are acceptable. An organization might say, if there is an impact that's out of variance of our profitability, and it happens occasionally, I would invest against that. But I might decide not to invest against a rare occurrence of being out of variance from my profitability. So I will invest against risks that are 3 times 3 equals 9. I can accept risks that are below 9. So I occasionally have an impact that's within variance. That's fine too. 3 times 2 is 6. I can accept that, right? So now that I've got the basis for determining what's acceptable to one impact area, I'm going to have to go back to what those regulators and judges were talking about. It's not just impact to me, it's impact to others, and it's impact to my mission or my utility. How do we describe that? Well, I've already described profitability. This is what risk assessment criteria might look like for a social health application. Let's say it's a company that makes a social health app that people wear in their watches. Watch is what they do. It prompts them for certain health activities. It's also gathering information about their health. And what they're doing on the back end is they're saying, if I can gather all this information about your health and I can correlate it to the prompts that I gave you, I can figure out which prompts work to get people better health results. The community of data is what gives this value. So the mission of the app is user health. If it can show flat results, then there's a problem. If they have significant misses, significant flat results, then the mission is failing. If there are a majority of misses, there's a high impact to the mission. If they can't help users be healthy, that's a catastrophic aspect of their mission. But few flat results or significant results might be okay given their mission. It's acceptable. Similarly, obligations impact, we need to protect other people's information. If there's no harm or no concern of end users based on some breach, then we would consider those to be okay. If a few of our users were embarrassed by things that were disclosed about their health information, that would be unacceptable, right? So what we're saying is we're drawing a line between those things that are unacceptable to our users and unacceptable to us and unacceptable to our mutual interest, our mission. Now what I'm saying is, let's say I were to suffer $1 million harm. I'm not going to say $1 million of my harm is equal to $1 million of a user's harm. What I'm saying is I've got a line that I draw for what's acceptable to me, and I'm assuming a line that will be acceptable to them, and I'm going to draw my risk analysis based on what's mutually acceptable to us. Now it gets interesting, right? Because there's a way to bring together what everyone's interests are. We're looking at what's important to us and to individuals and what's mutually interesting to us. Now we're not only thinking in terms of business and what matters to us, what we want to go well, we're thinking the way the legislators, the litigators, the regulators are thinking about reasonableness, right? So when we do this, because HALOCK's team has been working with organizations, we've done this for companies well into the 3 digits, so well over 100 organizations, and we have never found risk assessment criteria that's identical to any other organizations, whether it's because of the industry that they're in or even 2, 3, 4 organizations in the same industry. They all have different ways of defining their mission, their objectives, and their obligations, because every organization is unique. But if we're to take the concept of duty of care risk analysis and define it in its simplest terms, here's what duty of care risk analysis is doing. And here's how it's similar to what regulators and litigators are asking. Neither your conduct nor your controls may create a likelihood of harm to yourself or others that's large enough to require correction. Just think about what that means. If my risks are low enough that any harm would not require correction, or my controls are not so burdensome that they would require correction, then we're all okay. Doesn't mean that we have to be accurate in our risk assessment, but it means we have to think those things through and do it explicitly that shows that we took care of ourselves and others on equal terms. Now, we're not seeing this capability with other risk assessment methods or other security assessment methods. If you look at maturity models, gap assessments and audits, factor analysis for information risk, they all contribute something to the conversation. The blue columns are those things that we generally see in practice for any risk analysis. The green columns are those things that regulators and litigators are asking us to think through. Did we apply a standard of care? Did we evaluate harm to others? Did we define acceptable risk? And did we define what reasonable was based on a balance of those things? And did we evaluate safeguards to make the determination? What our clients are doing is they're finding that they start with one of these models, FAIR, Applied Information Economics, ISO 27005. It doesn't take a lot of investment to get them from where they are to full duty of care risk analysis. You would just look at the principles and practices in the DOCRA document. You can find it at docra.org. So how do I know I'm looking at a reasonable control? Well, let's say I did a risk assessment on the left, and I saw that one of my risks was over my acceptable level of risk. Let's say it was my risk to my obligations. That's all of a sudden not acceptable. If one person's not okay, no one's okay. If I can find a safeguard and put it in place where my mission, my obligations, my objectives are all okay, that's what I mean by risk reasonable or acceptable. I can show that I took care of everybody the same way, on our own terms. Let's look at how we apply this to CCPA and CMMC for our clients. These are 2 issues that come up a lot for our clients. For CCPA, sometimes the right to be forgotten is difficult to apply when the organization that has the data really needs it. And the CMMC case, when should this controlled, unclassified information be unencrypted? There are reasonable ways to figure these things out. Let's take a look. If we look at this first case of a reasonable right to be forgotten, let's say we're that social media application, that social health application. We're collecting data from our users and they consent to getting our data. And what are we doing with it? We're putting it with data scientists together in an analytic database that says, when I use these prompts, I see that health goes up this much. Well, I need a lot of data to get that information. If a bunch of my users all of a sudden on that top chart there, the top table say, we want to unsubscribe and you need to delete our information too once we're gone, that creates a problem if the smaller data sets are less insightful. That's our vulnerability. Now what happens? We're going to evaluate the impacts to our objectives, our mission, and our obligations, and we're going to take an intelligent assumption here. We're going to estimate, would that bring my objectives for profitability out of variance? Probably, because people would start to notice that they're not getting the results that they expected to get if the data samples are not as good, and we would get less profitability. The mission impact would hurt just as much. We would have significant misses because we wouldn't have the right analytics to give our users the right information. Would there be obligations impacts? Would there be impacts to users' privacy? No, that would be negligible. But we think this is a common scenario if we get a lot of people starting to ask for their information to be removed. That would give us a risk evaluation of impact of 3. The likelihood would be 4 common. That gives us a risk of 12. In plain language, we think it's a common problem if we get enough people deleting their information from our application that we'd have these out of variance results. So What if we decide, because that's unacceptably high, let's leave all the personal data in the analytics data set, even if people tell us not to? Well, let's walk that through a risk too. We've got to look through our safeguards as well. So we'll evaluate the safeguard the same way. In this case, no safeguard. But in this case, we're concerned that a third-party researcher who uses that analytics database, because remember, we are selling this data, might have a breach. And unsubscribers' personal information might be revealed in that breach. We think that's an occasional likelihood for that to happen. Again, we're using plain language. I think it's occasional that this kind of stuff happens, but many people would be exploited. And we would have up to 3 years of profitability loss. We may be able to recover, but that's a risk of 12 as well. That's obviously not a good solution. So how do we resolve that if we've got an unacceptable scenario? Let's take that same risk up in the top table, but on the bottom table, we're doing something a little different. The bottom table, we're saying, let's remove identifiable information from the aggregation table, from the analytic table. Now, if just that information's gone, but I still have the information I need to do the right analytics, just not identifying information, now my risk is much lower. It's rare, if at all, that any information would come out about those people who asked to be forgotten, at least. So now our risk is an acceptable level of 4. Let's go to a common situation we see with CMMC clients who are told that they have to encrypt this controlled unclassified information. In this case, same company. The API that they use to share this personal information from the devices to their analytics database the data is unencrypted between the API and the database. And it's unencrypted because the organization is using an intrusion prevention system to watch communications between those devices to be sure that there isn't an attack going on between them. But CMMC is telling us we're going to have to encrypt that data. Uh-oh, if I encrypt the data, I have a problem. We show what that's like on the bottom here. If the IPS can't actually look inside the data between the API server and the database server because it's encrypted, I actually have a higher risk than I have with the potential of a sniffer joining my network and somehow grabbing unencrypted data. I can have a safeguard that's greater, that gives me a greater risk than the risk that's meant to prevent, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I just allow the information to be continuously unencrypted and not change anything. I have an unacceptable risk in having the data unencrypted to begin with. So what if I apply a different control on the bottom? What if I isolate the API server interface, the database server interface, and an IPS sensor so I can quickly tell if something's gone into sniffer mode, into promiscuous mode? And I can quickly identify the problem and mitigate it very quickly by the IPS having a rule to block communications from the IPS sensor. Now, I'm going to have to do something. To respond and recover, but my risk now is much lower. I think this would happen rarely, if at all, that there'd be a breach with this scenario with just 3 sensors in this mini network. If that does happen, many could be exploited, but that's 2 times 4, which is 8. In plain language, if it's rare, if at all, that many would be exploited in this scenario, I can accept that risk. I have other things that I need to prioritize. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing a scenario where rather than getting audit results that tell us, oh, you're only currently compliant in blue to these areas, you need to get to 100% in all of them. No, what you're saying is you need to get to reasonable. That's what the regulations and standards are telling us to do, get to reasonable. In the case of CMMC, it's telling you to do a risk assessment. Well, what are you going to do with that risk assessment? You're going to figure out whether your controls are appropriate for the risk that you've got. Now, how do you use DOCRA if you want to get introduced to it? Well, it's freely available as a standard. Go to docra.org and you'll find it there. It gives you a set of instructions, mostly in the form of principles and practices for how you'll use your risk assessment method. It's been employed by Center for Internet Security in their documents, CISRAM. CISRAM is instructions, it's guidelines, it's tool sets, it's examples. It's a way for you to actually apply DOCRA using the CIS controls. You can use CISRAM for any control set you want. You can add to the CIS controls, you can do them separately with other controls, but you get all the templates, the work papers, and the instructions for applying the DOCRA principles there. Also keep an eye out because DOCRA is coming up in more legislative actions, in more regulatory actions, and it's going to be soon written up in a legal document that explains to regulators and litigators how to interpret reasonableness. If you have questions about DOCRA or CIS, feel free to stop into our virtual booth or definitely reach out to us after. We're happy to talk to you about this stuff. But it's very good being able to present to you today, and thank you for joining us.